Welcome, everyone. My name is Melissa Russell, and I'm going to be the host for today's webinar, Get the Gist of CJIS, what the new CJIS 5.9.2 requirements mean to you. I would like to go over a few things before we get started. We are recording this webinar, and we are also going to make the webinar recording as well as the slides available. You'll probably see them in the next day or so after the conclusion of the webinar. If there are questions, do feel free to put them into the Q&A section of the panel, and if we have a little bit of time at the end, we'll save some time for Q&A, but otherwise we can also take questions later. At this time, I'd like to go ahead and introduce our speaker, Wes Dobry. Wes is the principal engineer here at Eclipsium, and I'd like to thank him again for joining us. Wes, the floor is yours.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Melissa. So as Melissa was saying, I'll take you through a little bit about some of the new requirements and dive into exactly what this means for you and your organization. And ultimately, my agenda from a high-level perspective is we'll go through a little bit about what the new CJIS deadline is, what this means, define some terms that are within that specific new controls, as well as go into some details about those specific controls themselves and what this new terminology actually ultimately means from what controls do we need to put into place inside of our organizations. At the end, I'll wrap back up and bring this back into perspective, align everything back to CJIS, the deadlines and the timeframes, and hopefully educate you guys a little bit to what these new controls and guidelines actually mean. So first off, we'll dive right into what this new policy actually entails. So when we look at CJIS 592 versus CJIS 591, CJIS 591 was released in the latter half of 2022. In December of 2022, 592 was released, and this was a rather large change. Ultimately, the CJIS Policy Review Board looked at the policy and controls and said, we need to align this more closely with NIST 853 Rev 5 and brought a lot of specific controls over. So the new policy is actually 356 pages, and it's around 37.5% increase over CJIS 591. And ultimately, this is, again, a realignment or really bringing in a lot of the more standard controls that we're seeing in NIST 853 and other similar control frameworks from a standardization perspective. So when we start to look at what was actually added within there, as you read through the actual policy, everything highlighted in red, of course, is stuff that was added in that version, but they've added entire sections of controls. One of these sections, section 515, is around system and information integrity. And they've started to add a lot of additional components in there around monitoring, alerting, understanding information from the industries. And you'll see some new terms that have been added in there around firmware and integrity as well. And so when we look at these things, I'll define these terms in a little greater detail. But a lot of this stuff is brand new. They are things that we have not needed to worry about, haven't had controls in place, and are net new things that we need to focus on. So if we look at when 592 was released, it was released around 300 days ago in December and was given approximately about a year to implement. So the deadline was 10/1/2023. Which, as we all know, is 3 days ago. So as of right now, these controls that I'm talking about today are auditable inside of your organizations. So if your state or auditing governance components come in and perform an on-site visit, you are liable for these controls at this point. I've heard some rumblings that they're going to extend this deadline and give everyone another year to implement these controls. But as far as in my state, they're already telling organizations these controls are necessary and are starting to give them recommendations on how to actually meet these controls and what they need to do. So just as a heads up, if you have your on-site visit coming soon, you may hear more rumblings about these specific controls as part of that as well. So first off, I want to define one of the terms that's used, and that's regarding firmware. And traditionally, when we've talked to many different organizations and we look at things like firmware, ultimately, this has always been kind of defined as the BIOS or the UEFI of a system itself, and the system BIOS and those kinds of things. And so ultimately, as part of our things like our update processes, we've always said, okay, well, update the BIOS of the device and it's good, but it's always been a lower priority for organizations. But now we've gotten to a point where machines have become very complex. There's updatable components throughout a lot of different pieces of hardware when we're looking at things like x86 equipment. We have CPU microcode, we have management engines, we have baseboard management controllers on our servers, we have updatable code within our solid state disks. And all of these different components have a lot of, well, we'll say attack perspectives and vulnerabilities built into them. So we end up in a scenario now where updating firmware or any components below the operating system on a machine becomes much more of an intensive process that we need greater specificity around and controls around within them. This also means that if we start to think about firmware as anything that is not directly managed or upgradable in a standpoint of, packages that we can slice and dice within an organization, it now starts to mean it's also things like the operating system on our network appliances as well. So things like our switches, our routers, our firewalls, our load balancers, our SSL gateways, all of these different components. Managing and maintaining the versions on those and understanding the integrity of the firmware on those is paramount to understanding from a vulnerability and threat landscape perspective. And the reason why this actually is happening is that if we look at CISA or the Cybersecurity Infrastructure Security Agency's known exploited vulnerabilities reports, we actually see that ultimately the category of firmware, if we take all of these vulnerabilities and put them into different categories around things like, is it operating system, is it web browser, is it server, or is it things like the firmware of a device? So whether that be the switch firmware or the BIOS UEFI on a system, it's now the largest category of known exploited vulnerabilities that are out there. We've seen this year over year continue to grow, and it's quickly becoming the largest category of things that are actually initial vectors into organizations, along with things like our standard phishing attacks and stuff like that. So anything that's internet facing, like your firewalls and solutions like that, are now major attack vectors for these bad actors. So when we look at it from a updates and upgrade perspective, we need to start looking at it from a perspective of these devices are critical to our infrastructure. So let's take a look at some of the specific controls that have been added and how they relate on the firmware and the integrity side of things. So first off, if we look at the new controls related to SI2 or flaw remediation, they've added in again terminology around firmware updates and the timeframes that these updates need to occur. So now, not only do we have to do software and operating system updates, but we also need to do firmware updates, which also aligns with that firmware terminology of things like our network devices as well to remediate those vulnerabilities. But we also know that we have these timeframes where once the update's released, we have to get these upgrades done within that set period of time. But what you'll end up finding when we start to do advanced network vulnerability scanning and firmware inspection is that a number of these vulnerabilities that are actually out there remain unpatched. So what this actually means is that you may have a vulnerability that's discovered, the manufacturer hasn't released a patch on it. So you need to also be prepared to implement compensating controls to protect your organization from these flaws as well. So it's not only about being aware of the flaws, it's also about being aware of correcting these flaws with other compensating controls. So we've seen fairly regularly that some of these types of vulnerabilities can take quite a bit of time for these patches to be built. Log4j is a great example of this, where vendors were still finding Log4j many months after the vulnerabilities were disclosed. And then they release a patch on it. And we as organizations are still very much required to quickly implement a solution for those once that patch has been released. So it's about now we have to be aware of it and roll out those fixes very, very quickly. So it also means that now, as part of your configuration management and patch management cycle, we need to also have that inclusion of firmware as part of it, and making sure that we always are aware of what our firmware versions are and how we are remediating or doing any update processes on it if we're not already thinking that way. So next is really around looking at, again, in the flaw remediation side, but is also making sure that we understand that we can scan for these types of vulnerabilities. And so when we look at it from having vulnerability scanning tools installed and doing vulnerability scans, we also need to be aware that most of our network vulnerability scanners don't look at firmware. They look at things like, does this thing have a network presence that has identifiable vulnerabilities, or what version of UEFI or BIOS is installed, but they don't look at all those other firmware components that I was mentioning before. So things like your management engines, your hard disks, and other things that can, again, bring vulnerability, risk, and threat into your organization. So one thing to be aware of is that you may have a vulnerability scanner, understand what it does, what controls it can actually perform, and does it meet this specific framework guideline to understand if it actually does all aspects of vulnerability. The next control is around for real-time analysis of components. And when we look at things like real-time analysis of events, this is really focused on logging and understanding things. So when we look at it from a firmware solution standpoint, you need to understand that whatever solution is doing the scanning and doing the verification of these components integrates with your SIEM and SOAR solutions to build workflows around indicators of compromise and indicators of attack events and alerts. So whatever solution you do determine to go with to meet these controls, need to ensure that it integrates with your other security tools so that you're covered with both your events and alert analyses. Now, this one's a fun one around security alerts, advisories, and directives. They've added this one in to ensure that organizations remain up to date around what's the latest vulnerabilities out there, are things being actively exploited, what kind of threat identifiers are out there. Now, in the case of this one, I highly recommend to have all of your hardware vendors send you information, get this information from places like NIST and the known vulnerability databases and things like that. But I also am going to do a little plug here that we do a regular quarterly report that outlines some of the most advanced nefarious attacks that are seen out there. So if you haven't signed up for our below the surface report, I highly recommend going out, signing up for it. We again do it quarterly, and it talks about supply chain and firmware threat vectors. So it's a really nice report that I helped contribute to that talks about all of these areas below the OS that can present attack vectors for these nefarious bad actors, as well as things that are happening out in the industry. So you'll regularly see research out there about, new vendors that are being compromised, information around specific threat actor groups and things along those lines as well. Now the fun one, and this is arguably the largest part of the new controls that have been added and uses some of the most unique language within it. So when we look at this one around software, firmware, and information integrity, they use that new term integrity. So when we think about looking at it from a let's find unauthorized changes within the software, that means that now we also need to be looking at firmware and firmware configuration for changes. And this means identifying, hey, the firmware changed, and then understanding what that change entails. Was this a known good to known good change? Was this a known good to unknown change? Was this a known good to known bad change? And identify that. And this ultimately means that when we start to use the term integrity, that we're validating these components against a known good state and monitoring for any changes to that state against baseline. So integrity is becoming a much more paramount term that we've been seeing when dealing with federal government and high security organizations around validating these components against things that are known and verifying it from a trust perspective. So I always like to look at this from a standpoint of we can't identify if something's nefarious if we can't inspect it. So that's where integrity is starting to come into play, where we need to be verifying all of these components inside of our environment against what they actually should be. This also means, as part of these controls, that this solution must, again, integrate with our existing incident response processes. So if we do determine that a piece of firmware or a firmware change is something that is nefarious or has potential risk imposed on it, it needs to be integrated with our existing processes around incident response, notifications, and we need to make sure that people are aware and can take action against it. So switch gears a little bit and we'll talk about how we can actually help organizations regarding this. And so when I look at what you need to focus on within the organization and where we help is really the focus of what Eclipsium does. We're ultimately focused below the operating system, and we really look at that in three different areas. That's visibility, integrity, and security. The visibility side is that understanding what's actually happening within the environment and getting an asset inventory of all the components that are entailed within every machine and every piece of hardware inside of your organization. The integrity side is doing that verification to known good and tracking for changes against every piece of hardware and firmware within your organization. The last part's the security side of things. That's understanding any risk brought in by that device. Is there any vulnerabilities, misconfigurations on it, and understanding the whole picture of what or any risk that that machine brings to your organization. So we really focus in two different areas. One is the supply chain side of things, which is assessing new devices that enter your organization. Let's verify that the hardware itself is good and genuine. Let's verify that all the firmware and below the OS components are valid. And that's also verification of that there's no threats embedded in that device before you ever even use it. The other side of the equation is assessing existing devices, looking for that threat, understanding the vulnerability and patch management process, and of course, helping you to fortify that device by performing the patch management components therein as well. So an easy way to think about where we fit is when I talk to most organizations, the areas in green are areas where we generally have pretty mature security stacks. We're used to having our solutions like our EDRs, our XDRs, and I've put some examples up here. This also covers things like our network vulnerability scanners too, which give a pretty good perspective of what's happening within the operating system and up. Where these things don't really do a great job is when we start talking about the aspect of the boot process and below the OS from the hardware side of things. That's simply put where we fit. That's where we focus on. We focus on everything below the operating system and help organizations like yourselves to understand from the visibility, the risk, and the threat side of things. And ultimately, you'll find that we're very complementary to existing solutions that you have within your infrastructure. We want to fit in and present new, unique information that makes your organization more secure and have better understanding of what's actually happening. And this really focuses on things like that onboarding side of things, understanding what the device looks like before you ever bring it into your organization, the continuous monitoring or monitoring throughout the life cycle of the device from the time that you've brought it in to the time that you've retired it. And then lastly, the remediation side, which is integration with your existing workflows, as well as performing those firmware updates for you. So maintaining the firmware perspective throughout the entire organization. So let's go ahead and start to do a little bit of a wrap up here. And so ultimately, I forgot to update the slide. Sorry about that. The CJIS deadline was October 1st. So that was minus 3 days ago. Need to go ahead and evaluate what controls you have in place for these things and make sure that whatever you're doing from a perspective of patch management, you're covered on firmware side of things as well. Firmware ultimately is defined as anything really below the OS or the operating system on a network appliance. Within CJIS 592, an entire section of controls were added that really focus on the patch management related to firmware, vulnerabilities within firmware, and ultimately integration of those components with your enterprise security solutions. So, as always, I encourage organizations to patch early and often. We need to patch quickly. We need to understand what's actually happening out there as part of our patch management processes. And we need to be regularly scanning for any vulnerabilities that are occurring within the firmware of components themselves. Lastly, is really understanding that anything you're doing related to firmware, we now also need to be understanding for firmware threats, vulnerabilities, and notifications. And we need to be understanding everything from an integrity and known good standpoint. And if we're not doing that, it's relatively simplistic for attackers to make a change and have a scenario where you think everything's good, but things can actually be implanted and we actually never know about it. So with that, I'll do a little bit of a thank you for joining us today. And if you want any more additional information, please feel free to reach out via the Q&A, or you can go out to eclipsium.com/demo and do have another follow-up conversation where we can actually go deeper into the solution that we provide. So thank you everyone for the time today, and back to you, Melissa.
Thanks, Wes. And thank you again, everybody, for taking the time out of your day to join us. Just as a reminder, if you did join late, I did want to let you know we did record the session today, and we will be sending out links to the recording as well as a PDF of the slides in the next day or so. So look for that email coming in from us, and hope to see you on the next webinar. Thanks, everyone.